Well, hello from Adelaide. It's nice to be back in Korea, sort of, again. I haven't been there since 2007. Um, Today, I'm going to be pretty much of a talking head, um, which is not the best way to do stuff often. Uh, but I have quite a lot to get through. And if we don't quite make it, which is possible, um, I've actually constructed this into a paper. John Jugemheiner has got a copy, and tomorrow I'll post it on my academia net repository. I don't mind if you interrupt me. Uh, this is that's one of the beauties of Zoom, if it actually functions. Uh, what I've done is to take this topic, playing dumb in language learning, which sounds a bit strange, uh, and I've divided it into about 10 different parts. And these are the parts or the different approaches that I'll be trying to deal with if we get there. The first one is I've called the paradox of power in teaching. And the second one, the psychology of reciprocation. I don't know if you've thought about that much, but it's really important. The third section I've said as playing dumb inside a frame. That's sort of taking on a role. And the fourth, playing dumb as a license for clear language, not jargon. Often in universities, of course, we go the opposite way as a defense mechanism, I think, and use vague language, but that doesn't work well in language teaching. The fifth section I'd like to look at is playing dumb to justify speed and redundancy. I've changed my mind about how fast to talk in language teaching at different stages of teaching. So that is important too. The sixth part, playing dumb to build from a common base. I kind of mean a common base, finding a level playing ground as much as possible with the students you're dealing with, instead of sitting up there somewhere like God. The seventh section, playing dumb to license character roles, you and the students. You often have the feeling in another language that you're playing a role until you get really used to it. And of course, the students have that feeling themselves, or you do probably if you try to talk Korean. Anyway, the eighth part, playing dumb to dismantle textbooks for humour, chaos, and memory. I've done some terrible things to textbooks. Some of them are great, but others you actually have to modify. And the ninth section, hoping we get there, please read if we don't, playing dumb to learn from colleagues. And if colleagues, of course, can mean your fellow foreigner language teachers or lecturers, and also your Korean colleagues. who you probably have a different approach with. And then finally, this is a bit of a tale, but it's become more important to me as I reflect on what I failed at. And that's, hey, I'm really dumb. Help me with Korean or whatever country, whatever language you happen to be trying to get students to make a bridge from. All right. You're probably wondering what the hell I mean by playing dumb. And I'm going to use that term a lot. Playing dumb can mean lots of things, of course. But for our purpose here, I mostly use it as a kind of a shorthand to mean putting aside stereotypes about the roles of a teacher and students as we understand them from our particular cultural backgrounds. I'm an Australian. I'm definitely not an American, and I've got no hope of being a Korean. So we all interpret this according to our backgrounds. Our interest is not to suggest pointless anarchy as playing dumb, but rather my point is to free ourselves to find creative ways of teaching and learning in the most productive ways. Before a stereotype can be put aside, it has to be understood. And so I'll spend some time looking at a few habits we take for granted. Well, let's take the first angle I suggested. That was the paradox of power in teaching. Firstly, paradox is at the heart of our profession, I think. The first paradox, the professional purpose of all teaching is to improve the actual learning outcomes for learners. The learners, in our case, are students in institutions. However, from a management perspective, as teachers and learners, we are deemed to be productive if we can transit the maximum number of students, probably paying students, through our courses at a level which earns them an academic degree. Now, our medium of judgment happens to be student acquisition of a second language. That's a problem. Why? Well, for the institution, the employers, the general public, for the students themselves, most of them, the overriding objective, after all, is that academic degree. For the majority of students, the final relevance of actually acquiring useful control of the second language is secondary. Indeed, many, even most of them, will hardly make use of the second language beyond their formal education, and they know it. For teachers and lecturers, this is a huge dilemma. It's easy to become well, cynical. Here's the second paradox. In the fortress which is our classroom, as teachers we wield great power. It's a very temporary power, which is easy to forget. Part of our power is institutional, of course, but that is the least important part. The largest source of our power is control of the target language. English, in this case. However, out on the street in Korean society, typically as English-speaking foreigners, with probably little or no control over the local vernacular, we're as weak as kittens. Then suddenly back in the classroom, we are God wielding mysterious powers. Power corrupts. And nothing corrupts like the language power a teacher controls. In fact, we're the first to be corrupted into self-delusion. The second part of this talk I've called the psychology of reciprocation. If I give you a gift, the first time you might say, thank you, and feel some obligation. However, if I force gifts on you every day, pretty soon you're likely to feel guilt, then resentment, and then perhaps even anger. This is a common cycle in all mass education. As educators, we have a captive audience. We stand there shoving things down people's throats, repeating, this is good for you. One of the resources I've attached to a written version of this talk is a little paper by Paul Doyon, who teaches EFL to students in Japan. He discusses what he calls perceived value. To have your gift of English accepted by the students, they have to feel that they are offering you something of value personally. And you need to give them paths to reciprocate that gift. If you look at human societies everywhere, at any time in history, gift-giving rituals are universal. Why? Because gift-giving is a way to establish connections with other people. Gift-giving is also often how we establish and show power relationships. For gift-giving to establish close connections, it has to be reciprocal. Gifts are exchanged. Now, do you want a close relationship with your students, or do you want a power relationship? Teaching and learning linked in a reciprocal relationship is possible in both power and in close relationships. However, at least in my experience, in language learning, close reciprocal relationship leads to much better outcomes than a purely power relationship. Why are close reciprocal relationships superior for language learning? I think they're superior because this kind of reciprocal relationship creates intrinsic motivation, where students actually want to learn the language. Power relationships depend upon extrinsic motivation, like being awarded an academic degree. Well, what can students offer you in exchange for your gift of language? Few of them will know what to offer you. The possibility of exchange has usually not been part of their educational experience. You have to make it easy for students to give you gifts. No, not money. For example, maybe you can graciously accept their help with Korean language, or accept their help with understanding Korean politics, or table tennis, or accept their help with fixing your phone, or accept their help with a million other things. It really doesn't matter. In other words, be a dumb, friendly foreigner who is eager to help with language. You know about that with English, but is also eager to accept and appreciate help with a million other things. If you can manage this kind of friendship, you and your English language will be remembered forever. Okay, the third section is short, but sometimes one of the hardest to manage. I've called it playing dumb inside a frame. You live many, or you live many lives and play many roles. All of you, each of you. You're a particular kind of person to your family, to your relatives, to your friends, to your colleagues, to the institution you work for, and maybe even to the social media ghosts whom you know as, quote, friends. You're certainly a particular kind of person to your students, just as they are as individuals to you. These multiple lives and roles you play might overlap, or they mightn't. Who is the real you? You might kid yourself that there's only one you. But the people you meet in those different contexts know only a bit of you and fill out the missing stuff with their own stereotypes. If you could see their inner image of you, you'd be shocked. So let's consider these many versions of you as frames. Once you accept that a framed version of you faces your students, you can set out to shape a version of you which is best to help your students learn. I've already suggested that one of the best teaching versions, I think, of you is a dumb, friendly foreigner who's eager to help with English, which you know about, but who's also eager to accept and appreciate help with a million other things. Now, privately, you might consider yourself to be a hero or a genius or a bum. it doesn't matter. Put that stuff aside. In a classroom, you need to be the most effective possible teacher. The next short section of this paper, section 4, I've called Playing Dumb as a license for clear language, not jargon. There are certain truly dumb kinds of professionals, I think, who build walls around themselves with obscure, important sounding language. We see this endlessly amongst the most pompous medical professionals, lawyers, academics, and so on. They see profit and prestige in overawing their clients. They are the descendants of witch doctors. This kind of stuff is poison for effective teaching. Now, the world of self-important people might see you as a fool or dumb if you use the simplest, most clear language you can manage to help your students with learning English or learning anything else. However, if the students don't understand you, then clearly the cause is lost. You haven't taught. Remember, they're climbing out of a pit of confusion from L1 to L2, their first language, to English, L2. Climb the ladder with them. Part 5, playing dumb to justify speed and redundancy. Maybe very occasionally you've met a person who talks very fast, is very concise, and is actually very clever. That cannot be you in a language classroom. For the ears of people struggling to learn your native tongue, you'll seem to be talking very fast, seem to be. They have to decode what you're saying. And for most of us, the mental computer, as it were, goes into slow crawler gear for such decoding, especially until you're very fluent. It's exhausting. There's a big temptation for the learner to simply switch off. If you, super god, native speaking English teacher that you are, rattle on as if you're talking to your best friend, you won't be very clever. They have to learn to understand at natural speed, you say. I've changed my mind about this as I've progressed in what passes for a career. Well, yes, eventually. But maybe not at this moment. Be selective about when to push listening skills to the next level. Calibrate to the listeners, or you won't actually be teaching anything, nor will they be learning. Now, about redundancy. Redundancy in communication is about presenting information more than once. In native speaker speech, redundancy varies greatly with the person and the situation. Redundancy is needed because listeners or readers are not very efficient when it comes to when they receive or understand information. A common estimate is that there's 50% redundancy in native speaker speech. I suspect it might be more than that. Also, I've noticed that the design of information web pages, like news sites, for example, has changed recently to include a lot of redundancy. You get the same story 2 or 3 times on the same web page. That's not accidental. Also, when parents are teaching young children to speak, they spontaneously repeat themselves a lot. So, how much redundancy should be in your language classroom presentation? That will vary, of course, with the students in their level. Now, you don't want to be condescending, but hey, you're a dumb, friendly teacher, and maybe maybe a foreigner. So you already know that condescension is death to your enterprise. If you've sold this somewhat dumb-looking persona successfully, students will probably forgive a lot of repetition. And the truth is they need a lot more repetition than native speakers, usually. There's a secret trick here. If you do need to make your repetitions interesting. You can vary a little bit around the theme, and even a little funny. Interesting plus funny is magic for memory. Part 6, playing dumb to build from a common base. And here I'm talking about culture, general culture. Korean culture, like many other cultures, has traditionally put a lot of emphasis on hierarchy. That's partly the Confucian tradition. There may be some revolt against this amongst young adults, especially, but the expectation is still there. You're given a free pass as a teacher to be a somewhat elevated person who is supposed to be wise. Okay, you're allowed to be wise, but be careful about managing the social elevation because it's often a barrier to the kind of language learning you want to encourage. Lowering your status a bit might seem dumb to some students. not necessarily all of them. Each teacher will solve this problem in their own way. I happen to be Australian, which at least ideally, doesn't favour displays of social hierarchy. My particular pitch is that while this classroom might be Korean geographically, for now it's a temporary bit of Australia. So pretend to be an Australian. I'll help you with that. I'll help you talk like an Australian. But more than that, I'll help you act like an Australian. Next time, it's your turn. You can help me talk like a Korean and act like a Korean. Sure, we'll both make fools of ourselves and have a bit of fun, but we'll also learn something useful while we're doing it. Part 7. Playing dumb to license character roles. You and the students. Well, I've already mentioned this, but I'm going to expand it. You know, we're always playing a bunch of roles. We are teacher, student, foreigner, a local, an adult, a child, a friend, a husband, a wife, whatever. It's worth helping your students themselves think over this idea. Once they've grasped that there's more than one of themselves, it's not such a big step to add some imaginary roles to help with language learning. There's nothing new in this. As a method, of course, it's been used for centuries. But of course, some people are natural performers, while other personalities have trouble not being the real me. They might even think that playing a role is somehow dishonest or a game that only kids do. That's why it's useful to go through this process of discussing the many roles we play in life and persuading them that, well, to speak another language well, we have to adopt a persona and style which will fit the new way of thinking. The way human memory works, we tend to remember and recall things that are new to our experience. They have an emotional punch. For example, if Korea is not your home country, as a foreigner, you'll notice and marvel at things which the locals don't even notice. You might even keep a blog to write about your weird experiences, and you will talk about them for the rest of your life. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a Korean student. Classrooms, study, being forced to learn lessons. These have been part of your life forever. Most of it is most of it's a blur, a routine to get through and forget as soon as possible. Part of that forgetting will be boring textbook English, which was force-fed to you and often carried a tinge of failure. So a language teacher who wants L2 and English, say, to be remembered past exam time, has to involve those students in some kind of exotic experience. Convincing role play, engaging both the teacher and students in a new language and culture, can be one kind of memorable experience. Well, where does playing dumb come into language role play? In this discussion, I've mostly used playing dumb to mean a willingness to put aside stereotypical roles such as teacher and student in order to get past the psychological barriers of language learning. Now, if a teacher runs a stereotypical so-called role play, maybe from a textbook or curriculum, with a general air of somebody who is above this kind of thing, or this kind of nonsense, but is required to do it, then the whole process will be a pointless sham. If you, the teacher, are into role play yourself as an exotic, interesting exploration, then you've got a good chance of bringing jaded students along with you. The process will have a double emotional charge if you encourage and accept innovations and suggestions along the way by the students themselves. Part 8. Playing dumb to dismantle textbooks for humour, chaos and memory. Institutions vary about specifying textbooks for English language teaching. You know that English is a foreign language. In some places, textbooks are part of the marketing pitch. For others, they're offered as a crutch to teachers who were hired, no experience necessary. In some places, using a textbook is required. In other places, the teacher has a free hand. In any case, the vast majority of language teachers seek out some kind of textbook as an organized way to present a program without having to be too creative themselves. Well, how good and how useful are textbooks? Well, of course, they range from the very good, depending upon your point of view, to the awful. By the way, the value of a textbook has almost nothing to do with its date of publication. Publishers are running a business, so they have to splash the latest and the greatest every year or two, while valuable stuff often goes out of publication. The moral of that story is that if you see something good, grab it, hoard it. I have. And of course, now the clutter is multiplied by endless online resources too. And you have to be selective about those as well. Now, what's a good textbook for a student? It depends very much upon the student's personality, their language level, and the particular teacher who helps them to navigate the material. It's an equation. One personal test I apply to language textbooks is, could I find anything actually interesting in this book if it were not a language textbook? If the content is lifeless or pretentious, why would it be good for learning anything? Good learning material is memorable. Still, we're often stuck with textbooks we don't like. Is there a remedy? What can you do with a bad textbook? My personal solution is to destroy it. Hey, I don't mean burn it. I mean destroy the author's narrow vision and dull style. Bad books are a kind of gift for playing dumb genius, if you like. But for this, you need the mischievous cooperation of students. You have to have them in on the game. And this is a task that many of them will undertake with relish. Here's a random model sentence from a textbook that I still have. How beautifully she sings. I've seldom heard a better voice. Can you imagine actually saying that yourself? Well, maybe you could. I don't know you. But me, nah. I could never pass for a 19th century English lady of leisure. So with a spirit of cheerful anarchy, take the sentence apart, with the help of students, of course. Look at the grammar briefly. Imagine the characters. How would you say such a thing? How would your students tell or say their friends' karaoke singing was cool? Imagine other situations. The point of this game is that you are making stuff memorable. Even the grammar of the original sentence, which you satirized. Plus, you gave them tools to say something useful. Part 9. Hey, we're getting there. Playing dumb to learn from colleagues. Almost all language teaching poses as a simulation for language, which will be useful in the so-called real world. Maybe we don't examine too carefully what language is used in real life situations. However, we do pretend to be relevant. Although classroom language tends to be a simulation, there is one group we encounter daily whose language is all about their real life. And those individuals, of course, are our peers. Maybe colleagues have to be handled differently from students. What do you think? In every trade and profession, practitioners have to master two perspectives. Firstly, a set of procedures, and secondly, a storyline to justify those procedures. A dentist, for example, might be exquisitely skilled at pulling out your teeth, or hopefully a tooth. But if he removes it for the wrong reason, you have a right to feel aggrieved. The teaching analogy is not so clear-cut, but it's important. Supposing you process students through the curriculum and they duly graduate. Your official procedure was a success. However, if those students are unable to use the language or even unmotivated to try again, then the storyline, your justification for supporting your procedures was flawed. Were you really a professional or just a day labourer. Now, university language teachers especially tend to have strong opinions about the competence of their students, or lack of it. After a while, they also become confident of their own procedures and the storyline supporting those procedures. However, the wider evidence for effective second language teaching in countries like South Korea is dire. The evidence for English-speaking, in English-speaking countries for foreign language learning is catastrophic. Therefore, confronting teachers with what they do versus learning outcomes is not a path usually to popularity. So is there anything useful to learn from teaching colleagues? Well, yes. There's a great deal to learn from teaching colleagues. You mostly won't learn it by posing as an expert or offering loud opinions yourself. So you're in danger of being hung on your own lamppost, you will say. That's quite right. Why on earth are you still tolerating this presentation? But okay, back in the daily staff room, you might agree that your best chance of picking up on ideas is to play friendly, but, a bit dumb. You don't want to close people down. Welcome advice and opinion. You can pick up hints, ideas, techniques. However, some of the most useful things you might learn are what not to do. Of course, you won't announce that you're fishing for failures. Smile and make a private entry in your little black book of stuff to avoid. If you're a foreign teacher of English in South Korea, you do have Korean colleagues too. They have a huge amount to teach you, though it can be difficult to get that cooperation sometimes. You are, after all, not dealing with students who may culturally pretend to be inferiors, but with Korean professors, some of whom may culturally and professionally consider you to be their inferior. That's a fact of life. Managing that can take a fair amount of tact. I have to admit that with my crude Australian ways, Australians love teasing each other. I've crashed and burned relationships like that more than once. In this situation, it can sometimes pay to play the junior partner. Dumb if you like. For example, what does your Korean professor try to cover with his students? Have you ever actually asked him? the same students that you are teaching. What is his curriculum and game plan? What are his expectations of students? How can you best supplement his efforts? Now, 10. The end. I've called it, hey, I really am dumb. Help me with Korean. Teaching language is a very humbling profession. Unless you're one of those polyglot geniuses on YouTube, or unless you have a huge appetite for hypocrisy and self-deception. It's humbling because you realize that with luck, you might just make a lasting change in the ability, in the achievement of some students, at least a few students. It's also humbling because you realize that for large numbers of students, you might have been no more than a prison guard to be endured on their journey of being gifted some pretty diploma. But most of all, language teaching is humbling because you realize eventually that these students are making contact with you, a foreigner, across a huge language barrier in your language, not theirs. Now, how many of you have really made the journey in the other direction, into Korean, say? Hey, it's hard. I'm guessing, and pardon me if I'm insulting you, but my guess is that for most of you, beyond a few trivial phrases, most of you have never really gotten hold of this other language. That most of you have rationalized your way out of really learning it. I certainly did. I've lived a life of language hypocrisy. And looking back, I cringe at how much bad teaching has come out of that. I try to make it up now, kind of late in the day. Twice a week, I do a language teaching exchange with a young Chinese lady, plus plug away at an online course every day, and also while I'm out there running or walking. It's a magical mystery tour. All I want for Christmas is a big red reset button in a time machine. I need to go back 40 years and start teaching all over again. A better kind of teaching. Thanks for listening.